and military capabilities.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Coates and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Donald Trump taps up US Representative Michael Waltz as his next national security advisor. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem is picked for Secretary of Homeland Security. Israel's Defence Minister Israel Katz claims there will be no ceasefire and no respite in Lebanon. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, the most senior cleric in the Church of England, quits over sexual abuse cover-ups. And 35 people are dead and dozens more injured in the city of Zhuhai in China as a 65-year-old man is arrested for ramming them in his car. We begin in the United States, and President-elect Donald Trump is expected to choose Senator Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State as he continues to build his team after winning the election last week. The Florida-born politician is someone who expressed strong hawkish views on foreign policy and national security in the past. Here's more from our Washington correspondent, Nick Harper.
Donald Trump's lining up his loyalists for top jobs. He's expected to nominate Florida Senator Marco Rubio to become America's top diplomat, filling the coveted Secretary of State role.
Together with Donald Trump, we are going to make America not just great, but greater than it has ever been before.
While Florida Congressman Mike Waltz is likely to become his national security advisor. Both hold hardline views about China, pointing to the direction of future US foreign policy. Trump took a combative stance towards Beijing during his first term, implementing steep tariffs on Chinese imports. Those are expected to rise to 60 or even 100% during his second term in office. Rubio has foreign policy experience, currently serving as vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee and sitting on the Foreign Relations Committee. If confirmed by the Senate, Rubio would become the first Latino to serve as Secretary of State, underlining Trump's gains in the election with that demographic. Congressman Mike Waltz is a former military veteran who's previously argued the US should be better prepared for war in the Pacific against China. Another close ally, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, is being tipped for Homeland Security Secretary.
The only person in the race that I trust to do what needs to be done on these issues is President Trump.
The role will be instrumental in Trump's plans to secure the US-Mexico border and enforce the mass deportation of illegal immigrants. Meanwhile, the Republicans are closing in on full control of Congress. The party has already secured the Senate and is edging closer to gaining a majority in the House of Representatives, with vote counting continuing in more than a dozen races. With all of these nominations and appointments, it's clear that loyalty is being rewarded. Trump's picks for the top jobs are going to people who've remained faithful to the former president. They're now stepping up to fulfill his plans for more muscular foreign policy and tighter border security. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's go live now to Washington, D.C., where our chief correspondent, Simon Marks, is standing by. Simon, thank you for joining us. Firstly, what is the next priority in terms of filling positions, and any idea who Mr. Trump could be looking at?
I mean, it's hard to know what news is about to emanate from Mar-a-Lago down in Florida at any given moment, because there is clearly an intense process underway there, and we don't know precisely in what order some of these announcements are being made. But as Nick was reporting, the floating of Senator Marco Rubio's name as a possible Secretary of State last night, reported as it was by the New York Times, that was clearly some kind of a deliberate leak from inside Donald Trump's inner circle, maybe to gauge the reaction to that publicly, because we had thought here that the Secretary of State position was going to be filled by Rick Grenell, a much more hardline figure than Marco Rubio, and someone more focused on Europe, really. Marco Rubio brings expertise with regards to China and also Latin America to the table. So that's one possibility that we're watching for. Also waiting to see who gets the nod for the Pentagon. We now know it will not be Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, who coveted the opportunity to go back into a Trump administration. Donald Trump has said no thanks. He won't be bringing Mike Pompeo back in any role. So we're waiting to see. Could it be Congressman Mike Rogers for the Defense Department? Might it be Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, a retired military figure, both of them close to Donald Trump? And that suggestion of Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, for the Department of Homeland Security, that seems pretty well sourced. And if it is her, that will again underscore that Donald Trump is looking for loyalists in all of these key positions, people who believe in his America First, Make America Great Again agenda.
And we will, of course, be following this very, very closely. I want to ask you about something else there, Simon, and that is Mr. Trump promising to pardon people connected to the January 6th Capitol riots. Can he actually do this?
Yes, he can. He absolutely can pardon anyone that's been convicted of federal crimes. Not all the January 6th protesters have been convicted in federal court, but many of them have been. And we don't know whether he intends to pardon or commute the sentences of all of them. There are hundreds of people that have been jailed in association with the deadly riots on January the 6th, 2021. But he had certainly indicated before the election campaign and during it that was on his to-do list, and I think there certainly will be. There's obviously a process that has to be gone through in order for pardons to be agreed, approved, and then announced. So it's not going to be a day one decision, but it's definitely something that's in his inbox.
And just very, very briefly, Simon, almost out of time, what about Trump's New York sentencing for these 34 counts of felony? Can we ever expect this to happen?
Well, it increasingly looks like it's never going to happen. The judge in the case has received an appeal today from Trump lawyers saying that all of this should be set aside now that Donald Trump is about to become president of the United States again. The judge has delayed processing that was underway ahead of the sentencing that was due to take place on November the 26th. And I think most legal analysts think that it's perfectly possible he won't get sentenced, and even possible that the convictions will be set aside.
Simon Marks there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Let's take a look at some other stories making news around the world today. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Brussels as Washington looks to surge military aid to Ukraine and reassure European allies in the final days of President Joe Biden's term. Blinken will engage in discussions with European Union and NATO officials in Belgium's capital. Gang violence in Haiti has forced the temporary closure of the international airport after 2 US passenger planes were shot at as they approached Port-au-Prince. Videos circulating on social media show bullet holes in the cabin of one aircraft, while a crew member sustained minor injuries. The escalation in violence comes hours after Haiti's interim Prime Minister Gary Coney was fired and replaced by Alex Didier Filzami. An inquiry into a brutal stabbing attack at a mall in Sydney's iconic Bondi earlier this year has found that the perpetrator, Joel Cauchi, fatally stabbed 6 people and injured 10 others in the space of just 3 minutes. The rampage left a baby without her mother and prompted renewed debate about gendered violence. Cauchi, who was said to be knife-obsessed, was shot dead by police. New Zealand's Prime Minister has issued an historic apology in Parliament after an inquiry discovered 200,000 children and vulnerable adults were abused in faith and state care facilities between 1950 and 2019. A report on the scandal revealing a wide range of abuse, including rape, sterilisation and forced labour, with many of the disabled victims coming from Maori and Pacific communities. Israel's newly appointed Defence Minister Israel Katz is vowing the war in Lebanon will continue, dismissing calls for an urgent ceasefire as heavy fighting continues between Israeli forces and Hezbollah. Posting on X, he said, "We will continue to hit Hezbollah with full force until the goals of the war are achieved," adding, "Israel will not agree to any arrangement that does not guarantee Israel's right to enforce and prevent terrorism on its own." Well, a statement contradicting Israel's Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, who said yesterday that there was progress on a truce between the warring parties. Let's go straight to Tel Aviv to our correspondent Giles Gibson. Giles, thanks for coming on. It was only yesterday that Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar suggested that there was progress on a ceasefire, and today the Defence Minister ruled it out. In your opinion, is this a sign of disagreement within the Israeli government?
Well, Sarah, certainly very mixed messages coming from the men who are right at the top of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government. And I think a really subtle but significant change in tone from Israel Katz, the new defence minister. Just looking at this post that he put out earlier on X, he talked about a picture of victory and worsening Hezbollah's capabilities. So in that language, there is a sense of continuity, right, of not getting the job done just yet. Contrast that to what he said just a few days ago over the weekend when he said that, in his opinion, Hezbollah had been defeated. So there is this subtle but significant change in tone coming over the last sort of 12, 24 hours or so from the new defence minister.
And Giles, Lebanon Speaker Nabi Berri, who negotiates on behalf of Hezbollah, said on Tuesday that there is no sane person who thinks that we will agree to a settlement or a solution that achieves the interest of Israel at the expense of Lebanon and its sovereignty. Is this a sentiment shared by the Lebanese political establishment?
Well, publicly at least, the interim Prime Minister Najib Mikati has been saying that he wants to see a ceasefire that is agreed by all of the sides in this conflict. And he's also been repeatedly calling for the re-establishment of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. That was something that was approved back in 2006, and it created what's known as the blue line, which is not so much a border, but it's really described as a line of withdrawal by the United Nations, behind which they want to see Israeli forces retreating. Hezbollah, they have been saying throughout this conflict that they are not even going to come to the table for serious talks unless Israeli attacks stop. And look, just over the last 12 hours, We've continued to see these Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon and other parts of the country, and of course Israeli boots still on the ground in the south.
And just very briefly, Giles, that deadline that was set by the United States for Israel to get more aid into the Gaza Strip, that was November 13, of course, that falling tomorrow. Any indication that this is actually happening?
Well, no word from the State Department yet on whether they're going to follow through on their threat of sort of putting at risk security support for Israel. But we have had these 8 agencies, including Oxfam and Save the Children, saying that in their opinion, Israel has just not done nearly enough to meet the criteria set out in that letter sent by the Biden administration on the 13th of October to the Israeli government. And they're also saying that actually the Israeli government has taken actions that have dramatically worsened the humanitarian situation inside Gaza since that letter was sent.
Giles Gibson, they're live in Tel Aviv. Giles, thank you. Let's take a look at some other stories making news today. Well, Germany will hold snap elections on February 23 under a new plan agreed today between Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats and the centre-right opposition Christian Democratic Union. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said he has no intention of meeting representatives of the Taliban during the COP29 event in Azerbaijan. During today's summit, the British leader pledged to reduce gas emissions by 81% over the next 10 years. French newspaper Le Monde, alongside several other publications, have taken joint legal action against social media platform X. Now, they claim the site used their content without paying for it and violated publishing rights. And people in Pakistan's Punjab province are choking through record-breaking levels of toxic smog, so thick it's able to be seen from space. Well, the environmental hazard has already caused more than 40,000 people to seek medical treatment for respiratory illnesses, with restrictions now imposed on outdoor activities in a number of areas. To the United Kingdom now, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, England's most senior cleric, has resigned after a report found that the Church of England covered up sexual abuse by barrister John Smith. Now, the report accused Smith of abusing more than 100 children and young men in the UK and Africa over 5 decades, and concluded that he might have been brought to justice had Mr Welby formally reported it to police a decade ago. Now, for more, I'm joined from London by Ollie Barrett. Ollie, thank you for coming on. Firstly, this news comes 5 days after the publication of the report into Smith. Why has Justin Welby decided to resign today?
Well, I think Justin Welby just felt that he was coming under so much pressure that his position was becoming untenable. He had initially, after the release of that report, Sarah, said that he had consulted with senior colleagues in the Church of England and had decided that he would not resign. But since then, there has been a petition online signed by thousands of people calling for his resignation. We saw a pointed failure of the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Baku today to take up the opportunity to give Justin Welby his backing in any way, insisting that this was a matter for the church, but as I say, not giving Justin Welby his support in any way during a press conference in Baku. And the allegations were so serious and the questions therefore so serious for Justin Welby that I think we got to the point where, as I say, he felt his position was untenable. In terms of how he describes the decision himself, Justin Welby says it's very clear that he must take personal and institutional responsibility for his response when first told of the allegations surrounding John Smythe and the details of wrongdoing back in 2013. Justin Welby saying in the statement that he thought at the time the police had been notified and that therefore the case was being handled. But that independent report that you referenced said that Justin Welby himself could and should have done much more to deal with what is clearly one of the most prolific abusers ever to have been associated with the Church of England.
And Ollie, in a statement posted on X, Welby says, when I was informed in 2013 and told that police had been notified, I believed wrongly that an appropriate resolution would follow, but the independent report suggested that he could and should have reported this to the police. These are contradictory, are they not?
That's exactly right, in the sense that Justin Welby is effectively saying that he thought that this was being handled, but the report is saying that he should have more formally notified police, but also made sure that this was being dealt with. When John Smythe died in Cape Town in 2018, he did so without having faced justice, and this independent report certainly believed that if Justin Welby and those around him in the Church of England had taken concerted action back in 2013 to make sure that these issues were being followed up on by police, but also by the church itself, that things could well have turned out very differently indeed. The political process now, there is involvement from the Prime Minister Keir Starmer in exactly what happens next. It could take months before a replacement for Justin Welby is found. Going back to the police report and exactly what happened back in 2013, it's exactly that has led to claims from critics of the church of what they see as a cover-up after 2013. They believe that the church at the time wanted to avoid all these negative headlines that could potentially have flowed from a police investigation. But Justin Welby putting out that statement today, insisting that he has to take responsibility now for this scandal. And as I say, that process will get underway to choose his replacement as the most senior bishop in the Church of England, but also the ceremonial leader for millions of Anglicans in the Anglican communion worldwide.
Ollie Barrett there live for us in London. Ollie, thank you. At least 35 people are dead and dozens wounded after a 62-year-old man deliberately rammed his car into a sports centre in the southern Chinese city of Zhuhai late Monday. China's President Xi Jinping has called for an all-out effort to treat those injured, whilst the suspect is said to be recovering in hospital. Laura Westbrook has been reporting on the story from Hong Kong. Laura, what can you tell us about what happened?
Well, according to reports, people were exercising at the Zhuhai Sports Centre when a man rammed his car into a crowd on Monday evening local time. Now, this sports centre attracts residents to run on the track field, play football, even dance socially. And there is a designated walking path that is surrounding the perimeter of the stadium. One witness told a local magazine that at least 6 groups of people were gathered there for their regular walks when a car suddenly charged at them at high speed, knocking several people down. Some elderly and children were among the injured, and they have been sent to hospital, according to reports. The 62-year-old male driver, whose surname is Fan, has been arrested, and state outlet China Daily has called it a hit-and-run incident. Police are still investigating, though, and so far, no motive has been mentioned.
And this incident took place in the same city as the high-profile Zhuhai Air Show. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Security is very tight right now in Zhuhai, and that's because of the Zhuhai Air Show. This is China's biggest air show and the first to be held since China lifted its tough pandemic restrictions last year. And so a lot of videos that were posted online have been taken off Chinese social media. Chinese internet censors are known to take extra care to scrub social media around major events such as the National People's Congress. It is unclear whether the incident was linked to the air show. Now, the air show began on Tuesday at a venue just 40 kilometers from the stadium. It is showcasing a new stealth fighter jet for the first time, as well as attack drones. And China is modernizing its armed forces, and this is all part of Beijing's efforts to match America's fighting and military capabilities.
Thank you, Laura Westbrook in Hong Kong. Police in Amsterdam have arrested at least 5 more people in the wake of last week's clashes, which broke out between locals and supporters of Israeli team Maccabi Tel Aviv following a Europa League football game. Now, overnight, the city saw another surge in violence with an empty tram set on fire, although it remains unclear as to whether these incidents are linked. Our correspondent Will Denslow sent us this report.
More unrest on the streets of Amsterdam. An empty tram was set alight with some rioters reportedly shouting "Free Palestine," according to local media.
Yes, that was that place where I was grown up, in that area. So I saw it. Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. It's scary. It's anxious.
Meanwhile, police say they've made 5 more arrests in connection with the violence seen Thursday. An Israeli football side, Maccabi Tel Aviv, played a match in the Dutch capital.
Amsterdam looks back on a pitch-black night, and it is still dark today. Hateful anti-Semitic rioters and criminals attacked and beat up Jewish Israeli visitors to our city.
The new arrests are in addition to the more than 60 made by the authorities immediately after Thursday's events. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof called the attacks nothing short of shocking and reprehensible. Some of the travelling Israeli supporters have also been accused of violence and chanting anti-Arab slogans. The city has subsequently imposed a temporary ban on demonstrations.
The reason of the violence is not explained well or explored well in the right way. I think it is very, I'm sure there's anti-Semitic reasons to the things that happened, but I think a bigger explanation is the war and the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And I think that part of the story, the lack of the reasoning there creates a lot of anger around me, with me, and around the people I'm with.
Attention is now turning to Paris and Thursday's Nations League fixture between France and Israel. Roughly 4,000 police officers are being deployed to the game, and Israel's National Security Council has warned citizens about attending sporting events. French President Emmanuel Macron is due to attend, and authorities say they won't tolerate any violence. William Denslow, Arabiya News.
Let's take a look at some of the top business news. And oil giant Shell has won its appeal against a climate change ruling which asked it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Appealing at a court of appeals in The Hague, the oil and gas producer's case was dismissed on the basis that the company is meeting its set emission targets. Shares in motoring company Nissan have jumped 21% since activist investor Hafissimo Capital Management took a stake in the Japanese firm. The car makers previously announced thousands of their workers would lose their jobs after a decline in sales in China and the US. Wall Street firms could pay out substantial bonuses to financiers this year in the first rise since 2021. It's thought to be down to a recovery in deal-making, with the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates and equity markets increasing to record highs. To sports news now, and Gary Lineker has revealed he'll quit the BBC's flagship football show Match of the Day at the end of the season. The presenter has fronted the program for 25 years. Here's how he broke the news.
Obviously, it's an ever-changing feast, football and television and football and rights of the Premier League and stuff like that. So all of these things will play a part, but I just feel it's been an absolute privilege to have presented it for, 25 years now. I must be getting old.
And former UFC fighter turned heavyweight world champion boxer Francis Ngannou is in Dubai today for a PFL event. He's revealed that he'd like to get back in the boxing ring after his recent knockout victory against Renan Ferreira in Saudi Arabia. Let's get a reminder of our top stories. And Donald Trump taps up US Representative Michael Waltz as his next national security advisor. The South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem is picked for Secretary of Homeland Security. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz claims there will be no ceasefire and no respite in Lebanon. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, the most senior cleric in the Church of England, quits over sexual abuse cover-ups. And 35 people are dead and dozens more injured in the city of Zhuhai in China as a 65-year-old man is arrested for ramming them in his car. And that is it for us at W News. Thanks for joining us. Coming up next is Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, you know, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake, because Harris, well, a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019 she failed, 2020 she failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy. Yeah,
the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government, because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work because my family, you know, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he sacked or he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds. Because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, you know, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I point that out is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you ride against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the Supreme Leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there. Squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, reciprocal tariff act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He's just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. No, we want to stop. I mean, because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the supreme leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal, you can't use their courts. Good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the US, the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it,
I would.
a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great, it depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I'd pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because, remember, they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the supreme leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So, again, squeezing the supreme leader's head there is good. And it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the supreme leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just, somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as
obviously
markets. So it affects the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing, so we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think... and you don't have to do this. I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector, you're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. It's in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support... The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no
I'll pay
longer
a pretty penny for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
like on Shark Tank.
The whole thing is, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Osaka. There's just so much to learn, see, and do. Osaka has a population of about 2.5 million. Often, Osaka is considered the anti-capital of Japan, where Tokyo is its capital. It is the central metropolis of the Kansai region and the largest of the Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto trio. However way you regard the city, there are many opportunities for you to discover it. Enter the city and you'll immediately get a feel of its commercial-centric vibe. To be able to tour around it better, know how the city is divided into 24 wards. There's Kita, the newer center of the city. Umeda is where the main terminal is located. You'll find the huge department stores and boutiques there, as well as theaters for entertainment. Just look for the shops clustered around the JR Osaka Station and Umeda Station. Namba is the main railway station, also surrounded with department stores and endless places for shopping. Meanwhile, Minami is the traditional commercial and cultural center of Osaka. It is further broken down into two wards, Chuo and Naniwa. Shinsaibashi and Hori are the fashion wards, while Dotonbori is the best place for eating and dining. Semba is where you will find the business districts of Yodoyabashi, Duojima, and Homachi, as well as the financial district of Kitahama. Tennoji is the area around the main subway stations and rail lines. The ward was named after the historical Shitennoji Temple. You'll also find the zoo and the park here, as well as the Tsutenkaku Tower. Then there's the Shinsekai, known as the amusement area in the old days. Of course, there's the Osaka Castle, one of the most visited tourist attractions in Japan. Kyobashi nearby is where you will find the Osaka Business Park. The north includes the Shin, Osaka, and Juso wards, while the east houses Osaka's suburbs. The southern suburbs of Osaka, containing various districts, which has the Sumiyoshi Taisha Grand Shrine. And finally, the Bay Area is where you'll see the gigantic facilities.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thank you so much for joining us. No Country for Love. This is your latest book, and a long line, quite frankly. You've had some prolific years. Walk me through how the idea for this book came to you.
Well, you know, this is my first novel. So all the books I've written before were non-fiction books about Saudi Arabia, about Middle East, and about the war in Ukraine, this latest war that started in 2022. And I was living in Kabul when the conflict in Ukraine really began in 2014 with the first Russian invasion, when Crimea was taken, when really bloody conflict erupted in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 people were killed at the time. And I remember reading about it and watching the news and being flabbergasted by just how misunderstood Ukraine was, how little knowledge there was of Ukraine's history, its past, and how everything that was known about it was known through this Russian colonial lens, because Russia was the colonial master for centuries, and all the experts and many of the journalists, having lived in Moscow, just saw Ukraine through the prism of Moscow.
As an extension.
As an extension of Russia, and explained its history through the Russian history. And I think the idea of this book for me was I was so upset about it, and I remembered my own family stories, the family stories of so many other Ukrainians, and decided to write a book that is explaining Ukraine, explaining the tragic history of Ukraine that really is, the reason why Ukrainians are so resilient in fighting against Russia today. And to do it through the history of my family, my grandmother, and the tribulations that she went through, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, which is really a period when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth. Because the combination of the famine, artificial famine, orchestrated by Moscow that killed millions and millions of people in the 1930s, the execution of the Ukrainian intellectual class, World War II, the Holocaust, and the insurgency after that war, really, wreaked havoc across Ukraine and destroying its best minds and a large share of its people.
Yeah. What I found interesting about this narrative, so much of it is based, right, on the life of your grandmother.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. It's obviously it's a work of fiction, but many of the key turns in this narrative are really, based on true stories that I heard from my grandmother, from my family. And, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and, some of the actually most stunning turns of events in the book are from real life. Yeah. And it's informed by a lot of research as well. So I started writing this book in 2014, and I finished writing it just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022.
It's very interesting as well that your main character is a liberated woman, a new Soviet woman, if you will. And she sees the events of her life through that lens. She's not torn by religion in the same way that her parents were. She's not torn by social convention in the same way women in other democracies, for example, would have been torn. Yeah. She sees the events of her life as a liberated woman.
Right. Well, there was a lot of promise in the initial Soviet experiment. It was tragic, and it led to massive devastation and death. But there were some elements of it, like social liberation.
Yeah. Which inevitably was rolled back.
Was rolled back as the regime became more and more conservative.
Yeah.
And so this book is also a story of dashed hopes, because it begins with the main character moving to Kharkiv, which then was the capital of Ukraine, to build a new life, to build the massive tractor plant, and to join the university, and find her husband. And then all of this gets crushed by this, meat grinder of history, as one of the characters says it, because tragedy after tragedy befalls upon her. And at the end of the day, it's a book about survival against all odds, about survival in this, circumstances that are very hard to imagine for us even now, today, even at the time when there is a horrible war going on in Ukraine. But things were so much worse back then. And the cost of that survival, the betrayals, the compromises one has to make for one's own sake, for the sake of one's children, to actually live through all of this, and is it worth it at the end? That is sort of the biggest question of the book.
Yeah, and even against the backdrop of sort of not just the history of Russia, but the history of Ukraine in relation to Russia, which is, as you say, the meat grinder of history, so much hope and promise, and a consistent, sadly, narrative of that rolling back, whether it be through armed conflict or through governments or political machinations. In your mind, where is Ukraine on that journey today?
Well, it's a very good question, and it really links back to the past, because people are all very often puzzled. What is happening in Ukraine? Despite all this death and destruction, and hundreds of thousands of people are killed or maimed, fighting against overwhelming odds, the Ukrainians keep fighting and keep sacrificing and not giving up now for 2.5 years. And I think the explanation for that lies in this past. That's in the fact that everyone like me has a family that lived through all these dark years in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, when just being Ukrainian was a crime, speaking Ukrainian could be a crime, and there was a mass genocide during the artificial famine. And so and these are the sort of policies that are now being praised in Russia again. You know, the first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the famine of the 1930s because they say it never happened.
Revisionist history.
Exactly. It's so on part of Ukraine, it's sort of never again, but on the part of Russia, it never happened. So it's a complete denial of the tragedies of the past, and I think that explains what the Ukrainians are fighting, because they know that the alternative to surrender would be so much more death,
yes,
and so much more destruction, the way it happened back in the past.
Yes. How does generational trauma play into not just the book, but also the Ukrainians' fight today?
Well, I think generational trauma is the explanation for the resilience of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian military, because there is this knowledge back in the bones of everyone. Everyone has a grandmother, great-grandmother, who either was in the camps or who had family that died in a famine, terrible famine that had cannibalism and just things that are unthinkable now, or in the war, and so, or in the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with inhuman means. Or the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with really brutal ways. And so people know that if they don't fight, if they don't keep up the resistance, the price they will pay will be much higher than what they're paying today.
Yeah. How difficult was it for you to write from a woman's perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Because you have some insight.
Yes, well, I had good readers and good advice, I guess, but I did a lot of research, and I did actually speak to my grandmother before she passed away at the age of 96. So, the older one gets, the more, I guess, the franker one gets about one's youth, yes. So I did a lot of research in Ukraine before the war, going to libraries, to archives, so I tried to really create the narrative in a way that is most reflective of reality. It's obviously not a nonfiction book, but I had to be really accurate with the historical record and with the historical descriptions of the way things used to be.
Yeah. You also, in the last couple of years, have written another nonfiction book. And of course, that's about your experiences on the front lines of Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Our enemies will vanish. When you look at that book and the body of work that you did at that time and where we are today, what in your mind is the main difference? Is it the international backing for Ukraine in terms of weapons? Is it the fact that the entire world rallied around the Ukrainian cause? Perhaps not the global South, but certainly in the West?
Well, actually, so Our Enemies Will Vanish really focuses on the first year of the full-scale invasion, and not that much has actually changed since then. If you look at the map of the conflict, here and there the Russians gained, the Ukrainians gained a little bit in the Kursk region of Russia, but overall, the overall front line hasn't really changed. So there's been a war of attrition going on since then. I think what has changed is the erosion of the Russian red lines. So things that were unthinkable back then, such as long-range Ukrainian strikes, all over Russia, hitting military airfields, oil refineries, Ukraine actually invading sovereign Russian territory. All of these all of these actions were thought of as, triggering nuclear war, completely unrealistic. And yet Ukraine showed that this can be done. And I think Ukraine is successfully, since then, redrawing the parameters of the conflict. It's not able to advance in the battlefield necessarily, but it's expanding the war into Russia, and it's creating costs for Russia that it has to reckon with.
Yeah, and that there's also, of course, been the cost for Ukraine and not just lives lost. In your mind, how close are we to an end to this conflict today?
It's hard to predict, but it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, really. Russian government, President Putin and other senior members of the government have not given up on the initial aim of the invasion, which is to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country. And they still talk about Odessa and Kharkiv and Kiev as being Russian cities. And nothing indicates that they are ready to accept Ukraine as an independent state. Yeah. And the Ukrainians, while suffering from the consequences of war, economic consequences, millions of people had to leave the country, hundreds of thousands were killed or maimed. However, they're not ready to sacrifice the land that is Ukrainian, and they're not ready to give up just yet. So I think we're in for months, years, possibly, of continuing warfare.
In your mind, does the U.S. presidential election have anything to do with that timeline? Because, of course, former U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled, he'd end the war the day he got in office, or at least try to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, peace comes from a decision by one or both parties that they cannot achieve their objectives through war. And that requires one of the parties to be defeated, or at least to feel like they have more to lose from continuing than from stopping. And we're not at that stage yet. President Trump, former President Trump, has said he will bring peace to Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't said how. I'm sure Ukrainians would love to have peace in 24 hours. The question is at what cost?
Yeah, and politically, you don't see President Zelensky having any wiggle room when it comes to an agreement that would see him give up territory.
Possibly. I mean, it depends on how the conflict continues and depends on what level of casualties the Ukrainians sustain. But, he created new chips on the table. By occupying part of Russia, there is now part of Russia that can trade for Ukrainian territory. By having these long-range strikes into Russian territory, he can now trade that for Russia stopping attacking Ukraine with its missiles and long-range drones. Sorry.
I'll let you choke. Talk to me about the cabinet shakeup. President Zelensky, several months ago, changed up his defense minister, and then just recently his foreign minister as well. And his foreign minister was a gentleman, Dmitry Kuleba, who was well-loved by many Western democratic leaders. Was this wise, in your mind, to change horses midstream?
Well, it's not the first shakeup that the Ukrainian government has since the war began. We've had the defense minister removed, we've had General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, removed, and sent to London.
Controversially.
Right, and sent to London to be ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom. So the power really rests within Bankova, the headquarters of President Zelensky's administration. That's really where all the decisions are made right now. And he removed the foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. He appointed to replace him Andriy Sybiha, who was the main foreign policy advisor to the presidency, former Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey and Poland. And then in another sort of important shakeup, the Minister of Strategic Industries, which means the Minister of the Military Industries, commission was moved to the presidency to be the president's advisor for strategic industries, which is actually a raise, a promotion. So at the end of the day, the only two people who make sort of all the main calls are Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak.
Who is a controversial figure.
Well, everyone is a controversial figure.
In your mind, especially with this, the promotion of is it now the ministry? He's now an advisor of the president. That, of course, is interesting from a business perspective because there were comments very early on by those in business in Ukraine. They were worried about being nationalized. Industries from energy to what is now military production. In your mind, are those fears valid?
Well, I can speak to military production. I think what's happening is that there was a decision to really expand that sphere, which is critical for Ukraine's survival, especially in things like drone production, to the private sector. So there are hundreds of individual producers that are all competing for this projects and are being paid by the government, partially with Western assistance. And we have seen the results in the drone industry of Ukraine really taking a leap and developing technologies that allow it to strike very long distances, more than 1,000 miles away in Russia, and really dominating the battlefield with drones in a way that Russia cannot, even though Russia has a much bigger industrial base.
And today, the drone warfare between Russia and Ukraine is the most deadly.
Well, it's certainly critical, because everything is now determined by drones. FPV drones that cost a couple $100 can now kill tanks, and that cost millions of dollars. And they're being used every day.
In your mind, when it comes to the situation today in Ukraine, Is it more or less corrupt than before the invasion?
Well, it's hard to say. War obviously corrupts. Every war creates opportunities for corruption. We've seen it in every war in human history. Just read Catch-22. What Ukraine also has is a very robust independent media, and so it does expose instances of corruption. The scandal of the defense ministry, where the result of which the minister had to leave and some of his deputies ended up in jail, was because of exposure by the Ukrainian media about kickbacks in the procurement of actually eggs for the military, and you have scandals breaking out all the time, and action is being taken when it's public. So I think this is the strength of Ukraine when compared to Russia, where I'm sure there is just as much more corruption, but because it's swept under the rug, very often you see the results of it in the underperformance of the Russian military.
Yeah, we've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE both instrumental in conversations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, working with the United States. Yeah. How interesting is that to you? Because you and I have both covered the Gulf countries for a long time now. I think that seeing that foreign policy influence in quite this way is really a new move for the Gulf.
Yeah, well, it's a trio, really. It's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey. And I think they all three work in coordination on key issues, obviously the prisoner exchanges, but also exchanges of this recent hostage swap deal, in which my colleague Evan Gershkovich was released in Turkey, was also partially negotiated with the help of Saudi Arabia. And actually President Putin publicly thanked Saudi Arabia for its help in this. And so these three countries have this unique position of being aligned with the U.S., but also having full relations with Russia. They have not imposed any sanctions. There are flights every day from Dubai or from Istanbul to Moscow. And so they have these lines of communication and are trusted by both sides.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because a few years ago, I would have suggested that Saudi Arabia or the UAE be the conduit for conversations, for example, with China, between the U.S. and China. And privately, I got a lot of pushback from U.S. officials who were not interested in allowing that to happen. But this invasion really sort of upset the table, in a sense, and brought the Gulf Arab countries very much into the fore of international relations in a way that they weren't before.
Right. But also, the U.S. has a direct line to China. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese officials meet and talk. That's not the case on higher levels between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah. So they need all the help they can get.
Exactly. And, it's an issue of trust. There has to be a place for this exchange, for example, that both sides trust. Turkey or Saudi Arabia, UAE are one of these places.
You're also the author of a book, The Siege of Mecca. Obviously, you covered what's been a drastic change for the kingdom in the last several years with King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, his son, the crown prince. In your mind, does Saudi Arabia today have an issue when it comes to how quickly they've modernized, how quickly they've become, frankly, a new country under MBS's reforms?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the one answer to this is that we haven't really seen any pushback that is concerning. There hasn't been violence, there hasn't been protests. So the society seems to be accepting all this, also because society has changed.
Yes.
With such a huge share of the population being young and much more open to these new ideas, to
and having
changes.
access to phones, which has
Exactly.
changed everything.
Yes, exactly. So, Saudi Arabia of today is a very different country from Saudi Arabia of even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I think the history of the book of the Siege of Mecca and the actual Siege of Mecca was that in 1979, as a prize for supporting the government retaking the Grand Mosque of Mecca, which was taken by a bunch of radicals from all over the world, the government of Saudi Arabia at the time agreed to reverse the slow liberalization of the country and to give the religious establishment control over much of the society. So that has ended under Mohammed bin Salman. The religious police was disbanded, and this, frankly, the country's on social level, in terms of personal freedoms, especially for women, is so much more open than it was a few years ago.
Yeah. So they have learned the lessons, in your mind, of what it means to frankly, hand over your power to religious autocracy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But also, times have changed all over the world.
Yeah. Talk to me about Afghanistan, because obviously you had a front row seat for not only the war in Afghanistan, but also, of course, the evacuation of the U.S. and the U.K. and other NATO members as they decided to leave that country. Disaster to disaster. Where are we today?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, on one hand, yes, the Taliban regime is terrible. You know, the restrictions of women are harrowing. You know, girls can't go to school. You know, women have a hard time having permission to work. But if you were to ask ordinary Afghans, especially in villages, not in the cities, many would tell you that this is all terrible, but there is no war.
Yeah.
Nobody's dying. And this is a new thing for Afghanistan. For 40 years, there was constant war.
Yes.
And so and that explains why there is no resistance to the Taliban today, because no matter how difficult the restrictions are, the fact that people do not have to bury their children every day, the fact that there's no bombings, no raids, they can travel the country, go to markets, visit each other, I think still outweighs any appeal that the resistance might have against the Taliban for now.
In your mind, what is the responsibility of the West to these women that we told you can live a modern, full life?
I think it's huge.
We've abandoned.
I think it's huge. I mean, there were many promises made to the people of Afghanistan over the course of decades, actually, 20 years of Western presence there. And then one day the U.S. just picked up and left, with people trying to cling on to the wheels of the planes taking off in Kabul airport. I was there watching it.
Yes. Is this a stain on the Biden presidency?
I think it's a stain not just on the Biden presidency. I think it's a stain on the collective record of the West and the U.S. and on the credibility that the U.S. has with potential allies. And I would say more. I think this is one of the reasons that inspired President Putin to invade Ukraine, because watching the disaster in Kabul in the summer of 2021, he could not help himself but conclude that we have nothing to fear from the West. And also, it's one of the reasons why the U.S. and others refused to give weapons to Ukraine before the war, because the images of the Taliban driving Humvees and MRAPs and even flying Blackhawks were enough to convince the U.S. and allies that if we give weapons to the Ukrainians, we'll see the same once the Russians take over Kiev. So it was a double blow to the Ukrainians.
Yaroslav, it's great to have you. No Country for Love, new book, everybody buy it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
If you ever have the opportunity to hold a manuscript, it will captivate you and take you to other worlds. As soon as your eyes fall upon its front page, you will stand amazed as you behold the style and method of writing present on it. Everything here is subject to rules, and writing does not stray far from this. Even the title and the basmala adhere to these rules, as well as the introduction, sections, chapters, and finally reaching the conclusion. The rigor of the curriculum is certain, as is good writing. The manuscript is divided according to its physical components, which are paper, midad, scripts, and binding. The content of the manuscript is another story. The research method is the basis of this content. After reviewing thousands of manuscripts and studying them attentively and carefully, it was found that most of them follow a similar methodological approach. The approach includes research methodology, classification, and authorship. It is a methodology that has been prevalent since the early beginnings of writing and is still present today. After the allure of the manuscript's exterior wears off, you open the cover, and your eyes will fall upon the first page, and you'll notice that it's most likely a piece of white paper. From here, you realize the first rule in the essentials of writing among the Arabs in the early Islamic era, which is to leave the first page of the manuscript blank. Nothing is written on this page, for fear of it being tampered with or contaminated due to frequent use, or perhaps some of the lines of writing become blurry. It was also placed for binding purposes, or to have plant-like decorations on it, or drawings. It is rare for manuscripts to have a specific page designated for the title. Many manuscripts have had the title page left blank. The copyists would add the title of the book and the author's name to it later on. The owner or the reader of the book may also do so. This explains the difference between the scripts and fonts that are found in the title and the manuscript itself. It is possible to make a mistake when placing the title of the book, or when attributing the book to an author. It is possible to sometimes find a preface or a prologue on the title page, or the ownership deed that includes the legal purchase details as well as the price paid for the manuscript by the buyer. On this page, you can also find the names of the witnesses who were mentioned, and many other things that have nothing to do with the author or the copyist. The introduction to the manuscript would not be without the basmala. Unless the first page or several pages of the manuscripts were missing. Some manuscripts that were written by non-Muslims would begin with the basmala, abiding by and honoring the Quran, and following the Quran's style and approach. They also praise the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, his people and followers, until the Day of Judgment, along with some prayers. When you browse through the pages of the manuscript, you will notice many writings that are found in the margins. These writings are called footnotes. After the scholars read a certain manuscript, they would write many footnotes as observations or comments. Even some of them, if collected and organized, could become a standalone book in their own right. After the doxology, the author would state, "And now." Then they would mention their name, the topic they desire to research, and the reasons that prompted them to do so. The scholar should mention their methodology and divide the manuscript into sections and chapters, among other matters that the author deems necessary. In the introduction, there is a lot of important information, such as the title of the manuscript, for example. The scholar may mention the title of another one of their works, which leads us to further know the author, if they were not already mentioned on the title page or in the introduction. The scientist may explain the subject they are researching and define its parameters. They would cite sources and references that they derived the material of their book from. The author would mention the name of their sheikhs and teachers, who they were taught by, or whose material that they had read. In the introduction, they would sometimes list the name of some of their students. When reading the introduction, we can discern what the copyist added to the manuscript. We can also find evidence or references to the date of when the manuscript was composed or classified. A summary of the material that the manuscript elaborates upon can be sometimes found. The manuscript's conclusion is no less important than its introduction or its content. It includes the information that it contained that was not found anywhere else in the manuscript, such as the title of the manuscript or the author's name, regardless of whether the author themselves mentioned it or the copyist did so. Some manuscripts may contain a phrase that indicates the completion of the text, such as, "The book is completed." In addition to the date of its completion and the sources on which the author relied on while categorizing their book. A historical event is mentioned in the conclusion, in which the copyist or author dates this copy of the manuscript. They can also include the title of another book by the author. The copyist has a way of writing the final sentences of the manuscript. They would usually be written as an upside-down triangle, with its base directed towards the top, and the top of the triangle would be at the bottom, and it was referred to as al-harda. Manuscripts have persevered and traversed through time to our current days. They were preserved and transmitted developments in the ways of writing and authorship among the Arabs. The content of their books form threads of light that still shine and glimmer to this day.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme. Donald Trump's cabinet is taking shape with Marco Rubio, also known as the Foreign Hawk, expected to be named as Secretary of State. A revived pact between Moscow and Pyongyang sees thousands of North Korean soldiers deployed to the Russian front lines. That's according to reports. And the US President-elect Donald Trump's pledge to pardon January 6th rioters sparks delay requests in their prosecutions. And Donald Trump is briefed by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's top aide on plans for Gaza, Lebanon and Iran during the next 2 months. Hello and welcome. We begin in Washington, where the US President-elect Donald Trump has made a new round of appointments. Well, according to US media sources, Marco Rubio, known for his hardline stance on China, is set to be chosen as Secretary of State. Well, that would make him the first Latino to hold that position. Also expected to join Team Trump, Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, and Stephen Miller, an unapologetic defender of Trump's tough immigration policies. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Clark Judge, a former speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. It looks like the incoming administration is taking shape. Senator Marco Rubio tipped for Secretary of State. Do you think he's the man for the job?
He's a very good pick, and it also indicates all of these are going to indicate priorities. Senator Rubio, Florida, Cuban in background, speaks fluent Spanish. I believe Spanish was his first language. Florida is also a center of, was a center during part of his time before being before election to the Senate, was a big source of our fight against drug importation. So this suggests that there'll be a big emphasis on Latin America and particularly on Mexico and the drug problem in Mexico and the Secretary of State's role in the border issue as well. He's a good pick for that.
I mean, some call him a China hawk. Do you think Beijing's worried about this appointment?
Everybody who's appointed to the administration will be a China hawk. That's a fair statement.
When it comes to Ukraine, Rubio has said in the past that he's not on Russia's side, but he did say to NBC back in September, unfortunately, the reality of it is that the way the war is going in Ukraine, it's going to end with a negotiated settlement. How worried do you think Ukraine should be about his appointment?
It depends on how the negotiated the settlement is. I don't think his appointment in any way signals a difference from what Mr. Trump has already said about Ukraine. Want to get it ended, wanted to get it ended in a way that's decent for the Ukrainian people, and but do want to get it ended and not in a way that advances Russia.
Before I talk about anybody else in the new lineup, I just want to stay with Rubio for a little bit longer because he's made some pretty personal attacks on Donald Trump in the past. I'll tell you a couple of the things he said about him. He's called him a con artist. He once said he was the most vulgar person ever to aspire to the presidency, and he said he's not going to make America great again. He's going to make America orange. I mean, it sounds like he's really patched things up with Donald Trump. But knowing what you do of Donald Trump, is he someone who overlooks personal attacks like that and sort of puts them to one side?
It depends on the context, but I suspect if you went and looked for what Mr. Trump has said about Senator Rubio, you'd find it just as bad. They both, particularly in 2016, both slung things at one another. It is very much, I'm told, in his business dealings before he entered politics, Mr. Trump was in an environment in New York, particularly in his construction business, where the various parties were very harsh on one another and what they said about one another, but afterwards went out and got a beer together. So it's I think Mr. Rubio's like that too. They're both adults, and they know that after it's over, the contests are over. In that case, presidency in 2016, that they had common interests and common views, and so I don't put any stock in that as an ongoing issue.
Let's talk about some of the fairly notable absentees, at least for the time being, on the list of Trump appointees. Not seeing Nikki Haley's name anywhere. Neither am I seeing the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Do you think we're likely to see them in an eventual lineup?
Well, Mr. Trump has said that they will not be in his cabinet, and even in his administration, I believe. But he certainly said not in his cabinet. They were both harsh and late to the game in terms of lining up. So, we'll see. But I would say that at least for the first year, you won't see them.
Okay, let's look at the UN ambassador appointee, Elise Stefanik. She doesn't have an awful lot of foreign policy experience, does she? And I'm just wondering what you make of that particular appointment.
Well, she's a harsh critic of Iran. She has been very much outspoken in terms of the Iranian policy and her dislike of the way the last administration handled it, the Biden administration handled it. She is the first in her, just a personal note, she's the first in her family to go to college, and she graduated with honors from Harvard. She had positions in the George W. Bush administration, sort of early positions, but still substantial. She's extremely bright, extremely articulate, extremely determined. She made a big mark for herself earlier this year when or late last year, but I think it was early this year, when three college presidents were called before her committee in Congress to explain the anti-Semitic outbreaks on their campuses and why they'd been so passive about them. The result of that, she was the leader in the criticism and the questioning, the most effective of those. And the result of it was that all three presidents ended up losing their jobs. It probably improved the reputation of those schools, Harvard, Columbia, and Penn, University of Pennsylvania, but they were, they were reprehensible, and she brought them to task and got high marks in lots of places for that.
Yeah, and that probably explains, doesn't it, the enthusiastic sounds we're hearing from Israel with regards to her appointment.
She is a strong supporter of Israel and a fearless critic of anti-Semitism.
Okay, so obviously Israel enthusiastic about the shape that this national security team is taking. Iran, right to be worried?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The President Trump will be as aggressive and maybe even more so as Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is also the thing that came up in the campaign quite a bit was Mr. Trump's understanding, which apparently eluded Mr. Biden and his team, of the link between finance and the ability of Iran to be aggressive. One reason for all the embargoes during the Trump years was, maybe even the main reason, was to deny them ability to finance events such as they did with October 6th of 23, which they apparently have almost certainly heavily financed and were involved in planning. That probably wouldn't have happened, that event, if Mr. Trump had still been president. For one thing, they wouldn't have had the resources to launch a war and finance it through their surrogates, Hamas and Hezbollah. So, yes, she is the entire Trump administration, I feel confident you can say, will be very, very strong about Israel and about Iran and in favor of Israel and putting Iran in a box.
Just taking a step back, and when we look broadly at what we know with regards to the appointees for the second Trump administration, we've got Tom Homan as the country's border czar. We've talked about Elise Stefanik as the UN ambassador. Susie Wiles, White House chief of staff. What sort of a pattern are you seeing here with regards to the profiles of the appointees?
This is a get things done set of appointments and administration. These are all people who do not shrink from controversy and do focus hard on their jobs and getting things done with none of the fantasy play that we saw in the prior administration that made for so much weakness and such bad results. With the border czar, he has a reputation, not only a reputation, but a history of being hard, tough on the border, on crossings, and on Susie Wiles gets things done. She ran one of the best campaigns I've ever seen. I saw it from a distance, but ever seen for the presidency, as opposed to the Harris one, which is now emerging as one of the worst run campaigns for the presidency ever, maybe the worst in modern times. So you go to Mr. Rubio, same thing. His Homeland Security advisor, I'm looking down there, Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. She has what I would say is an over-the-top reputation for toughness. She published a book last year of memoir and whatever, and in it there was reference to a dog that she was very fond of but was way too aggressive, so she shot it. So she she has a strong record in South Dakota, not necessarily a place where you would look to for because of its small population for a cabinet member, but she has turned its economy around. She's very tough, very capable of handling. And one last thing, she's South Dakota is from the upper Midwest. The upper Midwest is one of the areas that's been hit hardest by fentanyl and the fentanyl crisis. This indicates real backbone, both on border security, but also on drug importation.
Okay, so we've got a better idea now of what this second Trump administration is going to look like. It's taking shape still, and some of these appointments are not yet confirmed. But how many of the faces in the first Trump administration are we likely to see? And as an extension of that question, do you think we're likely to see a bit less turnover this time around? Because let's face it, last time there were 2 secretaries of state. There was Rex Tillerson, there was Mike Pompeo, 2 secretaries of defense, 2 attorneys general. I mean, do you think we're going to have a little bit less turnover?
Yes, you can't know because, somebody's wife gets sick or something like that. There are family needs and people end up resigning. And those are real risks, and it's 4 years. But in this administration, last time, it's said that Mr. Trump was as surprised as anybody else that he'd been elected. So they weren't really prepared to take over at that point. So they had some misfires. Mr. Tillerman was one of the early ones. People who weren't quite in line, and this time they have done extensive, I'm not revealing anything because it's widely known, extensive preparations for the new administration. The very fact that he's come up with so much of his cabinet so quickly is a good indication of that. They've been vetting people for months. They've been looking at their policy agendas for months. It is not the policy agenda that Vice President Harris was criticizing, which was done outside. In fact, those outsiders are now not allowed in the administration, period, if they had anyone who had any involvement in that thing. But the real planning has been very careful and very well administered and very well thought through. So I think there's going to be a lot more stability. They're going to hit the ground running the first day. That's our phrase for getting started fast. And I think you're going to see an administration that reflects the seasoning of the president and the time he's had to prepare.
Yeah, so it sounds from what you're saying like they're on schedule and more organized than the incoming administration was back in 2016.
Yeah, and frankly, more organized than the Biden administration was, or the Obama administration was, or any of the number. Maybe you'd have to go back to Reagan and the first Bush to have an administration that's as well organized at the outset as this one.
Sure, and we haven't talked about Elon Musk yet. Are you seeing him having a domestic portfolio, a more international portfolio, or no portfolio at all?
My sense is that he will have a roving portfolio. He has things to, and he has the confidence of the president on a lot of levels. He has demonstrably enormous talents, both in innovation, which is in industry, excuse me, and in following through and doing very, very complicated, taking on very, very complicated tasks, whether it's starting a new auto company, a high-tech communications company, taking it over and cleaning it up, or creating an extremely capable space exploration company. This is a man of considerable talents. It would almost be a mistake to put him in one narrow area. He should have ability to reach across a number of frontiers, and his role in getting control of the cost of government and levels of activity in government, I think, is indicative of selecting him for a role that takes him in many places. And those places will have implications both domestic and international, and as well as the budget.
And what about RFK? We haven't talked about him either. I'm just wondering how likely you think he is to get the health portfolio. And on that particular note, something I read by Michael Bloomberg today says, quote, a vaccine skeptic and a peddler of junk science, his theories would put Americans at risk. It doesn't sound like Mr. Bloomberg thinks he'd be the man for the job.
Yeah, you mean those who have lost out in this election have nice things to say about any Trump appointee? What a surprise! That was such a nice thing he said. Yeah, it's been ridiculous from the critics. They go over the top, and I think that this will be. It's not clear yet what position Mr. Kennedy has. What is clear is that he will have a position, and that it will have to do with health and nutrition. That's a big category, and we'll just have to see. He also, I would just say that on the question of vaccines, he has while he was still running, he qualified that quite a bit, and it had to do with specific circumstances. So I think that he's certain to have a position of some importance and sway in the administration. What it will be, we don't know yet, and maybe Mr. Trump knows, but maybe he's still thinking about his options.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Clark Judge, former speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tim. Bye.
Now, a newly rekindled alliance between Russia and North Korea is taking shape, this in the context of the war in Ukraine, and it comes with reports that Kim Jong-un has allegedly agreed to send troops there to support Russia in its push to retake the region of Kursk. Well, adding to Ukraine's concerns is the possibility of Donald Trump choosing the, quote, foreign policy hawk Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State. Well, Rubio, who has called for reducing US aid to Ukraine, could signal a major shift in America's support, and that's further deepening Ukraine's uncertainty. Well, for more on that, we can cross to Kyiv now and speak to Alina Frolova, who is Deputy Chairperson at the Center for Defense Strategies and Ukraine's former Deputy Minister of Defense. Thank you so much for joining us. Just starting off by talking about the new administration at the White House, is there concern that support for Ukraine will evaporate under a second Trump presidency?
Well, I don't think that it will evaporate because this is still the American obligations. However, we can speak about the value of the support and volume and speed of supply of that support. And of course, we do understand that the policy will be changed, and we follow that. However, I really think that the United States will stay here. But one of the concerns which were spoke by many like American senators, that Europe should take more lead for this support of Ukraine. And I think that this is specifically the point which new administration will insist on.
Yeah, I mean, it's not difficult to imagine Donald Trump saying something to the effect that this is a European problem, it needs a European solution. I mean, were he to leave this to Europe to organize amongst themselves, amongst the 27 EU member states, would that be enough help for Ukraine to survive?
First of all, I don't agree that this is only a European problem. I think that this war influenced very much on the whole scope of geopolitical problems which started to rise up after the Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think that's why the presence of United States and other partners is very important here. Obviously, Europe is not ready yet to cover the 100% of the requirements and requests which Ukraine has now to the supplies of weapons and munition. However, if we take the figures, Europe is quite equal now to United States, but there are some specific weapons and systems which we need from United States, and that can make a trouble if the United States will decide it to act in a different way. However, I do expect that President Trump will try to settle up the conflict in very short period, and here we all are completely sure that Putin won't go for serious negotiations now. That is why I think that in some period, seeing the results of these negotiations between Russia and United States, new administration, probably will come to the same policy which we had before with supplies.
Now, I want to talk about negotiations in just a moment, but I just wanted to ask you a fairly obvious question. But were the United States to withdraw support for Ukraine, how long could Ukraine manage for, do you think? How long would they manage to keep Russia away from taking further territory from your country?
Well, I don't think that Ukraine will collapse afterwards, yes, because we still do have supplies from the Europe, and the Ukrainian industry is rising very radically in numbers and in figures. I think that Ukraine will be able to continue to fight for a long number of years afterwards, but the resultiveness and the level of losses will be absolutely different.
So just going back to that point about negotiations, okay, so let's imagine a scenario in which it is decided that all parties will sit down at a negotiating table. Do you think it would be advantageous to Ukraine for that process to begin before the 20th of January when Donald Trump takes office or after that? And what do you think the reasons would be for your answer?
Actually, in current situation, we don't see any preferable positions for Ukraine on negotiations now. We don't have this leverage which we can use for pressing Putin, for example, to go to a negotiation table, not just claim his desires and his requirements, but to negotiate. And that is why I think, and the same it looks like from Russian side, because they do want to get more territories to have the better negotiation position, let's say so. But in case if Trump will behave like he promised, that he will ask Putin not to escalate, which Putin already not follows after their conversation, I don't think that Putin will be ready to negotiate. So I don't see any before coming to negotiation, some parties should prevail at the front line to have this argument. But for now on, we don't have it.
Indeed, and it's not likely to happen, is it? Because the winters in Ukraine are extremely harsh. We're approaching the middle of November now. It doesn't look like, looking at past winter months, like the lines on the advantages on the ground are going to change too much for either side between now and the thawing of the spring.
Yeah, we also do not expect that it would be. Yes, we see how Russia is pressing with numbers, with bodies approach, this dead bodies approach, and it continued to do so because actually this is the only pressing point which they do have, and they don't want to neglect it. But we don't expect that they will have enough manpower to do so, for example, for next 2 or 3 months. However, we cannot now prognose how the North Korea's numbers will play because we don't know whether these 10,000 are just first troops on the ground and they have agreement on much more, or this is everything we will have. But yes, we don't think that the front line will change drastically for the period before the spring.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the North Korean troops on the ground. Of course, these reports that there are, as you say, a number of them on the ground. We hear some of them are wearing Russian uniforms. I mean, how strong is the evidence? I mean, are you absolutely convinced that they really are on the ground?
Well, it's for us, it's surprised that still the Western countries are asking about the evidences because, first of all, already all the intelligence, including American one, confirmed that there is a presence. We saw a lot of video with all those troops being distributed in Russian uniform, also including in weapons. We have the intelligence data about where they are passing training and interoperability training with Russian troops. And we have a few already killed in action, which were reported. We don't have yet prisoners of war of Korean nationality, but I think that it's quite like a soon, which will appear the first sign. So they obviously there. I mean that this war is quite transparent from the point of view that you can, with drones, you can see everything and you can make a very good reconnaissance on the ground, and they are there.
And what's your understanding of why North Korea would have its troops on the ground? What's in it for Pyongyang, do you think?
Obviously, we see some kind of public negotiations. Yes, when they got the money for those people, which are quite substantial for North Korea, they got some support and they got promise of Russia to be on the ground in case of the conflict in between North Korea and their enemies, as they expect them. But one of the discussion which we have here, this is the big question about the nuclear technologies also. Yes, whether Russia should promise something for this geopolitical alliance, not only potential participation in the war. And so it can be nuclear, it can nuclear technologies, or it can be a decision of China. And actually, we do understand that both North Korea and Russia are quite dependent from China. And if China plays the bigger play with those two partners, so it can be just the decision of China to conclude such an agreement.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned China. We've talked about North Korea. Also reports that, well, it is widely reported that Iran has lent a significant amount of assistance, particularly with armaments, to Russia in their war effort. I mean, looking at what's happening in Washington and the incoming Trump administration and some of the people in that administration, it's very unlikely and very hard to imagine that new administration would want to see those countries, Iran, China, North Korea, rewarded for their help to Russia in its hour of need by territory that had belonged to Ukraine being ceded to Russia. I mean, that's a difficult scenario to imagine, isn't it?
Well, I don't know why, but I didn't hear from the potential Trump administration participants now that they see this like a partnership of four. They usually speak about China plus North Korea plus Iran, but no, Russia is mentioned there. Russia is staying somehow separately because before Biden administration was speaking about this like a evil club as a party of four. So the Trump obviously and his advisors are obviously taking Russia as a separate story. I think that this is a big mistake, and I think that the situation will change as soon as they will get deeper.
And just lastly, I mean, looking forwards to where things go to from here, I mean, do you have a sense of inevitability that a negotiated settlement will end up being the way for this conflict to come to an end?
Any conflict ends up with negotiations, but it's not the time now because Ukraine does not accept it.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Alina Frolova, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, on the 6th of January 2021, hundreds of rioters stormed the US Capitol, resulting in the arrests of more than 1,500 Trump supporters, many of whom were convicted of felonies. But with Trump back in the political spotlight, their fate may soon change, because during his rallies, the president-elect repeatedly vowed to pardon those involved in the insurrection. And that's prompted many of the convicted rioters to call on the courts to delay their hearings. Well, analysts believe that delaying or eliminating their sentences could possibly undermine what has been the largest federal criminal investigation in US history. Well, for more on the fate of the Capitol Hill rioters, I'm joined by Philip Lacovara, who is a former Deputy Solicitor General for the United States and counsel to the Watergate Special Prosecutor during the impeachment hearings of President Richard Nixon. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to start by asking you, I mean, I'm sure you're following this story with great intrigue. How much of a difference do you think it will make to the outcome of the the justice for the Capitol riot defendants, if indeed, when Donald Trump gets back to the White House?
Well, President Trump has promised, or at least seems to have promised, that he's going to issue pardons to some, if not all, of the January 6th rioters. And this has been an extremely popular position with his base. He regularly referred to these convicted rioters as the January 6th hostages. And he did talk about promising a pardon to them. And many of the people who are in prison today or serving sentences of confinement have called upon Trump to make good on what was perceived to be his promise to issue pardons for them.
Yeah, he's called them hostages. Other people are calling them political prisoners. I mean, is that the right legal language in your book?
I don't think so. I think the Justice Department and the FBI were very selective in going after the principal bad actors on January 6th. There were thousands of people who actually stormed the Capitol, but the government has focused on those who engaged in actual destructive behavior, assaulting police officers. I think that's one of the things that makes viewing these people as political prisoners so unseemly and really unfair to the dozens of police officers who were injured during the melee. And so to think of them as innocent political prisoners is just nonsensical in my view, and a distortion of the whole justice system.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people who's been charged is accused of hitting police officers with a bat, quote, multiple times. And just staying on this issue of law enforcement officers and law enforcement agencies, I wonder how they feel about the idea of pardons and whether you think this could somehow end up backfiring on Donald Trump.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it will backfire on him because his base does see the events of January 6th as part of the theme that the original 2020 election was stolen and that President Biden was never legitimate president. While normally Republicans like to align themselves with the law and order wing of American society, and that normally appeals to law enforcement officers, including police officers throughout the country, in this unique situation, and this is another example of Donald Trump being unique, there is a sense that the mere fact that police officers were beaten and indeed a couple of them died as a result of these confrontations, that doesn't seem to have enraged the rank and file police throughout the country.
Yeah, surprising, as you say. And there are, of course, about 1,500 cases relating to the 6th of January. And I'm just wondering at what stage they're all at. Are they all at an advanced stage or stages that have resulted in prosecution already? Where are we with all of those cases?
Well, interestingly, the government, the FBI and Justice Department are still pursuing some of the people whom it was more difficult to identify. A number of them have been sentenced to prison and served their sentences. A number are in prison. There are other trials or prosecutions awaiting disposition. And I think just within the last couple of weeks, one of the January 6th rioters was just tracked down and arrested close by here in Florida, where I am. And it made big news in the local paper that almost 4 years after the original event on January 6, 21, the FBI was relentlessly tracking down one of the rioters.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what you were saying a bit earlier on about the sort of the reaction we could get. I mean, it sets quite a dangerous precedent, doesn't it? The idea of pardoning people for crimes. I'm just wondering what you think, what risks are associated with that further on down the line and perhaps in different contexts.
Well, one of the things that had given me and other people who viewed January 6th as a constitutional outrage as well as a political catastrophe was that the principal rioters, the most violent people involved in that effort to prevent the transition of power, were being prosecuted. And I and others thought that would send a valuable signal that in this country we have elections, and when the votes are counted, power is transferred, and it is not a legitimate form of political protest to try to storm the Capitol and prevent Congress from certifying the results of the election. However, the exact opposite point would be demonstrated if President Trump goes forward with his apparent promise to pardon some or all of these people, because what it does is to license further disruptive behavior. If people are not satisfied with the certified results of an election, it would send the message that they're entitled to use force, and maybe when their party comes back into power, they will be spared the consequences of their crimes.
What sort of grounds are the legal teams representing those 1,500 people using to justify this request for a postponement of the proceedings for their clients? Tell us about the arguments they're putting forward.
Well, they range all the way from just seeking extra time to prepare their defense, await the inauguration of President Trump. Others say that in light of a Supreme Court decision within the last several months, some of the conduct charged is not actually criminally prosecutable. And that's thrown another monkey wrench into these prosecutions, because one of the typical charges that the government filed against these people was that they were violating a statute that prevents interference with congressional proceedings. And it seemed to most of us that, as a matter of common sense, that's what they were doing when they were trying to prevent Congress from counting the formal electoral votes. The Supreme Court's conservative pro-Trump majority ruled, however, that statute only prohibits interfering with documents, not with forcibly breaking down the doors of Congress to prevent congressional proceedings from taking place. Seemed to me to be an absurd, result-oriented decision, but that's the kind of argument that the remaining January 6th defendants are making, that they haven't been prosecuted under a statute that actually applies to the conduct in which they engaged. So there's clever lawyers for almost 2,000 people can come up with a whole array of arguments to try to stave off the day of judgment.
And do you think there are some cases and some individuals that Donald Trump, no matter what he feels, is going to be really unlikely to be able to pardon owing to the severity of the charges against them?
I think if he's got any sort of wise advice from his senior team, including whoever is selected to be his attorney general, he will draw some distinctions. And I think he can politically preserve the benefits of his campaign promise by deciding to draw some lines and excluding from any executive clemency that he decides to offer those people who were convicted of actually assaulting police officers. I think Trump could make that distinction as a politically salvageable distinction while still maintaining the loyalty of his base. And if I had to hazard a guess, it's hard to guess anything about Donald Trump, I would say that it's more likely that he will carve out a couple of dozen people from any general grant of executive clemency that he decides to issue.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, really for the benefit of our viewers who might not be so familiar with the US legal system and the comings and goings in the White House, but are there any examples you can think of legal cases being delayed in the past due to the fact that there's a new administration coming into the White House?
There have been a couple of white-collar cases back during the Clinton years when there was some attempt by a few defendants to defer at either the prosecution or the commencement of serving a jail sentence until the new administration came in because of the hope of pardons. Generally, though, there has not been a system in the United States of incoming presidents issuing pardons. It's more commonly been outgoing presidents who, as a matter of political gesturing or thanksgiving for political support, who have issued pardons to a narrow group of people on their way out the door, including sometimes to relatives who've been convicted of things like drug offenses or white-collar fraudsters turned out to be politically connected. And generally, after the president has been shown out the door by the electorate or because his term is expiring, that's when pardons are granted. It's very, very rare for an incoming president to issue pardons.
And just lastly, I wanted to ask you to draw some parallels with your own experience, casting your mind back to the 1970s and Watergate. And on that note, you said in a recent article, Watergate showed that the system works. I'm just wondering what the situation we're in now and in this particular context. What does this say about the system?
Well, to be more precise, what I said, and I've said this many times in the last 50 years, the system works only if the right people are in the right positions to make the system work. It's not the American constitutional system is not like a machine that is on autopilot and it works automatically. You have to have people of competence and good faith in the various positions to pull the levers of power. Then the system works. What we are about to see, I think, unfortunately, is a system that will go awry because President Trump, following the experiences of his first term, has now learned how to distort the normal checks and balances in the system. And one of his mechanisms, as he's learned, is his decision to try to cut out a major level of the bureaucracy who tried to preserve a degree of continuity and common sense in government policy, and that frustrated Trump. And so he has vowed to remove a whole level of the professional civil service. He's also learned that his initiatives can be hamstrung by courts who find that what he's doing or wants to do is illegal. And so he learned during his presidency about the importance of appointing favorably inclined judges to the Supreme Court and to the lower federal court. So the system only works to the extent that the people are in place in the system who will apply what I consider to be sensible and legitimate standards. And if the people in place are more loyal to Donald Trump than they are to the Constitution, then the system will work to his advantage, but not to the advantage of the American people.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Philip Lacovara, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Glad to be with you.
Now, moving to the Middle East, where Israeli attacks on Lebanon have claimed the lives of more than 3,200 people now, even as more residents face evacuation orders. Well, the capital, Beirut, was hit earlier today as Lebanon becomes the latest front in Israel's wars. Well, the Iran-backed group Hezbollah has been severely degraded ever since the pager attacks of September. But even so, the messages from Israel of a potential ceasefire remain mixed. Israel's foreign minister has been speaking of, quote, certain progress in those talks. But the defense minister is promising stronger attacks targeting Hezbollah until, quote, the goals of the war are achieved. Meanwhile, a summit of Arab and Islamic nations in Riyadh has condemned Israel's actions, and those present made calls for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's upcoming presidency and appointment looks set to play an even more crucial role in the entire region. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Michel Helou, who is the Secretary General of the Lebanese political party, the National Bloc. Thank you so much for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. I'd like to start by asking you about the top foreign policy jobs in the Trump administration. Obviously quite reassuring for some of the leaders in Israel, but what about Lebanon's leaders? What do they think?
I mean, it's a key question. Obviously, everyone is talking about that right now. I think there was a major, let's say, rift, or there was some sort of a competition between the more hawkish wing in the Trump administration and the more isolationist wing in the same administration. It seems that the hawks won through the very probable appointment of Marco Rubio as a state secretary, and the other roles as well that have been that we've been seeing. Elise Stepanik, the New York representative, as ambassador to the UN, etc. So, and as well as the NSC main appointment. So most probably it will be a quite hawkish administration. Now, we also know that Donald Trump is always in between both. In a sense that he doesn't have a very clear idea of what his foreign policy will be. I think he will really, we'll see probably a lot of variations in that. What I believe and what we believe, I think mostly as Lebanese, is that there is something that could be positive, which is a much, let's say, a stronger position towards what Iran could do in terms of interference in the region. So a strong position in order to limit Iran's influence in Lebanon and other Arab countries. However, the major risk here is that we have people that are quite extreme in their views, and people that will most probably not, let's say, not limit Israel at all, and not put any pressure on the Israelis in terms of their foreign policy. So this is extremely scary, because when you look at the appointments that have been made either by Netanyahu and his war cabinet, including the entry of the settlements minister, a woman at the war cabinet, and the replacement of Yoav Gallant, who is, let's say, the most pragmatic minister. The others are much more ideological. Combined with the new appointments of the Trump administration, I think this might be pretty dangerous for the region in terms of unleashing extremism and instability.
And there's another dimension to all of this as well, because according to Axios, at any rate, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, has already been holding talks with Donald Trump. Those talks, we understand, happened at Mar-a-Lago on Sunday. I mean, don't Lebanon's leaders need to be doing something to make sure they're part of the conversation, especially at these very early stages?
Look, you're asking the right question, the one that hurts as well. The issue that we have is that the government is quite absent, and Najib Mikati, unfortunately, remains under the strong influence of Hezbollah as a prime minister. And Abiy Birri, as president of parliament, is also under a strong influence of Hezbollah, and there's no president of the republic. So the reality is that today, as opposed to the last war in 2006, as opposed to the 1996 war with Israel, as opposed to the 80s, we have no government, or a government that is only here as a caretaker government, and we have no president of the republic. So Lebanon is very much weakened, and unless we see leaders that are much more responsible and much braver in their approach, I'm very much afraid that we might be the big losers of everything that might happen in the coming weeks and months. So I call on the Lebanese government first to play its role, Najib Mikati specifically, to start opening direct talks with the Trump administration and pressuring as much as possible. We have a very large lobby, a very large diaspora in the US, where we could be much more influential had we been more organized. So let's take advantage of that. Let's do something to preserve our country. And on the other hand, call on Abiy Birri, the president of parliament, to open the parliament right now so that we can elect a president. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to have a figure that really represents our country and negotiates in favor of our interests.
Sure, but Michelle, to give credit to your acting Prime Minister, your caretaker Prime Minister, Prime Minister Miqati, he was in Riyadh at that summit, joined by the leaders of 57 nations from Arab and Islamic countries. Together, they called on Israel to end its actions in Palestine and Lebanon. I mean, together, don't you think it's fair to say that sent quite a strong message, quite a strong signal to the Trump administration?
It did. It did. And I think that the Arab Islamic Summit that happened in the Riyadh was important. I think that the messages passed were the right ones, ones of the need for justice and stability in that region, and calling both for the respect of sovereignty, but also for the need of a proper, decent political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to the Palestinian question. We need a state for the Palestinians, otherwise we're never going to end this nightmare that we've been going through in the Middle East for more than 75 years. So the message was clear, and I think that the Trump administration will also feel that. And I think that the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman, specifically the Crown Prince, is not ready to normalize if there is no decent political solution to the conflict. And I think this is the right position to take. So we will need more pressure from the Gulf countries, and specifically from Saudi Arabia, I believe, in order to help us get to a solution in Lebanon and in the Middle East as a whole.
Yeah, but the messages that we're getting are quite mixed, I think it's fair to say. On the one hand, we're hearing from Israel that progress is being made on ceasefire talks. On the other hand, we're hearing that there'll be no ceasefire until, quote, Israel's goals are met. I mean, what's your understanding on where things stand with regards to those efforts to strike a ceasefire deal?
Look, Tom, no one understands what's going on. The reality is that the messages are mixed because there is no clear message apart from the fact that the Israelis will keep on fighting as long as they feel that they can fight and that they can win some ground, gain some ground in Lebanon and destroy more and more Hezbollah. The problem is that they're not just destroying Hezbollah, they're destroying immense parts of our country, of our land, destroying village after village in the south, in the Bekaa Valley, in Beirut, in the mountains, etc. So it's a very dangerous policy. And as long as no one puts boundaries to the Israeli aggression on Lebanon, they will not stop. So this is I think, something pretty scary. And the reality is that there is no clear vision, and the goals evolve day after day, just like it happened in Gaza since October 7. In Lebanon, it started with we want to apply 1701, then we want to bring back the populations of the north, and then it became we want to erase Hezbollah completely, but we never really know when it's going to stop, and it might never stop. So this is why we need a very clear stance from our government first, pressuring both the Israelis and with very clear asks to Hezbollah and to the Iranians, asking Hezbollah to stop the fighting and to agree to a clear implementation of the international resolutions, including in the end of disarmament, so that the state and the army can really take over. I think this is a very clear position that our government should take. And in parallel, a very strong lobbying through the United States, through France, through the GCC countries and Saudi Arabia, in order to pressure both countries, Israel and Iran, to withdraw and let Lebanon breathe and live, as Ghassan Touini used to say more than decades ago at the UN, when he would say, "Let my country live, let my people live." And I think that this is what we need to hear. But unfortunately, our government is absent today.
Yeah, and some analysts would say it's not just your government that's absent. There are 70 days left of the Biden administration in Washington. And some analysts are saying that the Biden administration doesn't look like it's got the leverage it needs to get any ceasefire deals, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza, before Trump takes office on the 20th of January. I'm just wondering how likely that sounds. 70 more days.
Pretty unlikely, I believe. However, there could be an alignment or an intersection of interest between Biden and Trump on this. And that's why Amos Hochstein is still coming to visit Lebanon to play his role of negotiator with the support of Donald Trump. I believe that in the end, the work that they're doing now, they're carrying out now, could also serve the Trump administration. And both administrations have an interest in stopping the war at some point. So I just hope that the Trump administration and Trump himself will wake up not too late and understand that their interest is really enforcing a ceasefire deal and not having unending wars and destruction in the Middle East for the years to come. And for that, they will need a bit of clarity, moral clarity, and a bit of courage in order to pass this message to the Iranians for sure, but more specifically to the Israelis, to their Israeli allies.
I just want to ask you about Hezbollah more specifically, because it's been about 7 weeks now since Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. Obviously, they've had numerous setbacks. Several top officials in that group have been killed. What's actually left of Hezbollah now, do you think?
Hezbollah has been drastically weakened. From a military perspective, we're talking about more than 2,000 casualties from many different accounts and different reports, but that seem pretty credible. We're talking, and of which more or less the entire military leadership, the top 3-4 ranks have been completely wiped out. So Hezbollah battalions are now fighting in a very autonomous way, with also limited communications means. I mean, they with the pagers and the walkie-talkie attacks, they've lost several means of communications, and we even wonder how they are communicating in between each other now. There has been an Iranian military leadership that has come in order to replace the former Hezbollah military leaders, but I am not sure that they will be able to fight very long with that sort of structure. We're also talking about several thousands of injured through the pager attacks and the bombardments, the continuous bombardments and fighting. We are talking also about a reduced missile capacity, because we're seeing that the daily launches of missiles and rockets have gone down quite also significantly compared to a couple of months ago. So Hezbollah's capacities are very significantly reduced. On top of that, the funding channels have also been, if not cut off, they've been also, put under pressure quite significantly, be it through the Lebanese-Syrian border, the various tunnels, and so the legal and the illegal pathways, but also through the airport. The airport is now being, according to various accounts, controlled by the Lebanese army in coordination with the U.S. So Hezbollah is clearly weakened. Now, what we need to know also is that they still have the ability to fight. I mean, they have dozens of thousands of fighters, and they're able to fight in their village, to do this guerrilla fight for quite a long time. They can resist. But in the end, there's no way they can win this war. Okay. And this is why I think the real question here is really about what's the end goal for everyone. We can keep fighting for years and years if we want, but nothing will come out of that apart from total destruction. So the only solution, the only exit, is a diplomatic exit. And in the end, it will end up with necessarily, I believe, the withdrawal of the Iranians, the fact that Hezbollah becomes a normal political party, and that's what we want from Hezbollah. We don't want Hezbollah to disappear. Hezbollah will not disappear, but Hezbollah will have to radically change and become a normal Lebanese political party and not a transnational militia. And in exchange of that, we have to demand very clearly the withdrawal of the Israelis, and we need to reject any sort of violation of our sovereignty from the Israeli army.
Michel, just lastly, a quick question, and it sort of circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning, US policy in the Middle East. Obviously, the Trump administration is expected to try and expand on the Abraham Accords. And I know it's very difficult to imagine at this particular moment in time, but can you see later on down the line that one of the consequences of this conflict will be an eventual normalization of ties between your country and Israel?
Look, I mean, what's quite striking is that a couple of decades ago, Israel was struggling and was doing everything in order to get peace deals, peace accords with Arab countries. They ended up getting a couple of them, Jordan and Egypt, and they've been bombarding the countries with which they weren't able to get peace. But today, or at least the neighboring countries, today it has shifted completely. Today, many Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia and others, and even Syria, we've been hearing a lot about peace talks between Bashar al-Assad and the Israelis since 2009. Many Arab countries are ready to make peace, or at least to have a stabilization of relationship. And the reality is that it's the Israelis that have become, let's say, that do not want, that have become allergic to peace. And when we see the way they are behaving with this extreme brutality and violence, it seems that for them, the Abraham Accords, normalization with Saudi Arabia and others have become secondary. And what matters for them as a priority is to finish the job, this extremely brutal job that they've started against the Palestinians, specifically since October 7th, but actually started a while ago, be it the forced displacement in Gaza and the destruction of Gaza, or also the potential annexation plan of the West Bank. What's going to happen with us will really depend on how the Israelis will behave. I think we should come back to the Armistice Accords of 1949, that agreement that allowed us to live 20 years more or less in peace and stability. But if the Israelis keep behaving that way and keep, carrying out those violations of our sovereignty in earth, on land, sea, and air, I don't see how we can reach that sort of agreement. So it really depends on their own maturity and their own willingness to reach stability and a serious ceasefire.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Michel Helou, thank you for speaking to Al Arabiya.
Thank you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Cape Town. See what nature and culture have to offer in Cape Town. Cape Town is the second largest city in South Africa and the southernmost city of the African continent. It is home to the famous Cape of Good Hope, where you'll get a thrilling glimpse of where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean. The city is also known for the Castle of Good Hope, with its extensive William Fair collection of art and military memorabilia. Another iconic destination is the Robben Island, which offers visitors a first-hand experience of the imprisoned history of leaders like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. The prison not only holds important historic significance, it also allows for a beautiful half-day ferry ride across the sparkling waters of South Africa. Over 20 million tourists also visit the Victoria and Alfred waterfront each year. it is known as the city's working harbor, where you can have plenty to do in terms of dining, shopping, and sightseeing. One of the 7 magnificent botanical gardens of the world, you should also have a look at the luscious and rare flora of Cape Town at the Kirtenbosch Botanical Gardens. You'll definitely come across impressive rows of rare African plants. It's a great place for botanical education. There are also a lot of marine life to see in the city. Cape Town offers a rare and up-close glimpse of these underwater animals while in their natural habitat. Table Mountain is the greatest and most popular landmark of Cape Town. It's one of the famous places in the city that features an incredibly unique and varied ecosystem. It's also suitable for leisurely walks or morning jogs, and great for hiking up to the summit. You can enjoy a hearty meal while at it, or simply take in the magnificent view. There are also many vineyards worth visiting in Cape Town. Along the endless stretch of hills and valleys are the vineyards that make the best wines in the world. Heavy with local culture are the colorful streets of Bo-Kaap. It is popular among the visitors of Cape Town, offering a lively glimpse into the culture of the Muslim descendants who created these enchanting streets.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the 3rd biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Well, my next guest is Dr. Richard Stainings, a cybersecurity strategist who's become one of the go-to experts when healthcare systems are threatened. And that includes major data breaches of medical records, hacking digital devices such as pacemakers, and even bringing down entire healthcare networks. Professor Richard Stainings, great to have some time with you, sir.
Hi there.
Now, I wonder, what sort of risks in particular do you feel the healthcare environment faces when it comes to cybersecurity? What are the key ones?
There are many risks across cybersecurity. Lack of funding results in an under-provision of cybersecurity services. Lack of prioritization results in the delay of cybersecurity policies, procedures, controls. And of course, cybersecurity is being impacted by the dramatic change of digital health, right? There is a huge transformation going on within the healthcare industry right now. The inclusion of a multitude of new IoT devices, for example. Artificial intelligence is playing a big part in healthcare moving forward. And these present an expanded risk profile for the industry.
And I'm going to go into those in a bit of detail. You have a lot of experience in this sector, and I wonder from your own perspective, what is your personal worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is that equipment in a hospital is compromised and used to assassinate a patient, right? That's an extreme risk scenario, and I don't really want to scare anyone who's watching this to think that that might happen in the immediate future, but potentially we have to look at attack vectors within the healthcare sector to understand what perpetrators may decide to do. And it's not just the monetization of stolen intellectual property that is driving cybercriminal activity. We, of course, have heightened geopolitical tensions today, and who's to say what some actor may decide to do in the future.
In doing my research, I think one of the things that struck me the most and was quite terrifying was how a few years ago the FDA in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, recalled devices, pacemakers. It sounds strange to recall a pacemaker because they were vulnerable to cyber attacks. So it makes me wonder, how much of a threat is that in this day and age?
It's a very real threat. Unfortunately, most of our medical devices that are in use, whether they're embedded like a pacemaker or an infusion pump for insulin, for example, or whether they're a large-scale medical device that we use to scan a patient, an X-ray or CT or PET or ultrasound system, for example, or a patient telemetry monitoring system, right? These are all systems that were designed for medical or clinical functionality. They weren't designed with security in mind, and it's only recently, thanks to FDA regulational change last year, that we've begun to see security designed in from the outset, and also medical device manufacturers being held liable to maintain the security of those devices. By that I mean conduct vulnerability assessments, make those vulnerability disclosures available rather than hide them, which has happened in the past, and to release patches in a timely manner so that systems can be updated and upgraded. The problem is the number of legacy medical devices. There are literally millions of medical devices that will be with us for the next 20 years. And those are not subject to the FDA rules. So we have a bit of a gap, as it were, in terms of how do we go about securing those devices.
Who could have imagined in the Internet of Things, as we call it, that includes now people, people having devices in their bodies, even that could be vulnerable. And I guess as technology advances, we're going to have more and more cyber parts, if you want to put it that way, which are going to be even more vulnerable to attacks. So this is a serious concern.
It's very much a serious concern, and you've only got to look at the growth of consumer medical wearables, right? We all walk around with an Apple Watch on our hands, or a Fitbit, or some other device that is tracking our level of physical activity. It's tracking our calorific intake if we program that into, or we enter that data into the system. And that is then being communicated via an mHealth app, right, a mobile health app, to our medical record in many countries. And Australia, as an example, has opened up My Health Record, which is their national health record, to include consumer medical data, so that data that a person generates as a result of their activity is now being entered into their electronic patient record.
Now, one thing that surprised me a lot when you and I had a chat prior to this interview was when you told me that the healthcare systems generate more data, far more data, than all other sectors combined. That just sounds staggering.
Yeah, it is. And the lakes of data should probably not be referred to as lakes anymore. They're more like oceans of data, right? Medical activity creates a massive amount of data, and of clinical treatments, of patient outcomes, all of this sort of data. And that data is extremely valuable to the medical profession in terms of being able to mine that data for AI, for example, for clinical decision support being a classic example, and various other forms of data. But there's also a huge concern with all of that data being generated. How do we go about protecting that data so that it doesn't enter, the public realm or is not stolen by criminals?
Yeah, that was interesting to me, that there have been some really high-profile healthcare breaches affecting tens of millions of people. It was really quite shocking when I did my research. And this concept of medical identity theft was something that surprised me. What is the consequence of such attacks, cyber attacks, for individuals?
So we have seen the increasing level of sophistication of cyber attacks against the healthcare industry over the past decade, right? It used to be that a perpetrator would or a group would infiltrate a hospital system, steal medical records, and then sell those medical records. We're now seeing the industrialization of that criminal activity, so that data is passed out and sold on to other groups. So, for example, personally identifiable information is sold on to identity theft rings, right? Medical data is sold to other groups that may be able to exploit that. Medical insurance data is sold to medical insurance rings, and of course intellectual property is sold to the highest bidder.
Richard, I can understand people wanting credit card details and things like this for identity theft, but what would they do with the medical information? I mean, where is it valuable to the thieves?
So the first thing is that if you or I were to have our credit card stolen, right, there is a very short lifespan for the criminals to use that particular data, right? Before we recognize that there's something going on with our account, we call our bank and we cancel the card and they issue us a new one, right? And it's in the mail within a couple of days. An inconvenience to us, but the banks are insured against criminal use, and they have anti-fraud systems and can detect nefarious activity very, very quickly. Now, a medical identity has a much, much longer lifespan. So if, for example, I, as a child, had my medical record stolen, I might not realize that until much, much later on in life, right? That information might not need to be exploited straight away. So I could have I could be involved in a hospital data theft, right? Or my identity could be involved in a hospital data theft, and the perpetrators of that crime would have years to exploit it.
So I could see that the people are scared to give out the medical information or have it out there because, for example, trying to get insurance, if the insurance company knows there are certain vulnerabilities a person has, their insurance premium might go up. But in terms of the thieves, what they could do with it, what are the most nefarious kind of uses?
Well, I suppose the most obvious is ransomware, right? It's taking that information, encrypting it to make it unreadable or unavailable, right? And then ransoming that back either to the provider of the healthcare services, the hospital system, or what we're seeing now, secondary and tertiary ransom attacks against individuals, either to persuade those individuals to contact their provider to pay a ransom to the criminals, or directly to pay a ransom to the criminals themselves so that their data is not published or their data can be unencrypted and available for them to use.
What do you believe are the most valuable lessons learned from these major breaches?
I think there are a number of lessons that can be learned. Firstly, criminals are very adept at changing their attack vectors, right? They're very creative in terms of how they exploit data once they've got hold of it, and it's a continuously moving target. And I think that represents some interesting lessons for cybersecurity professionals like myself and others, obviously, about how adept we need to be in terms of our cybersecurity defensive strategies, what tools, what people, what processes we need to bring to bear, and how we really need to prioritize cybersecurity of the healthcare industry, given the state of play of the criminal attackers today.
As someone who goes and advises healthcare systems about cybersecurity, how receptive have you found them to be?
I think there's a new openness. A decade ago, I would have these conversations with ministers of health or leaders of healthcare systems around the world, and there was a certain degree of it'll never happen to us, a certain thought that would be the case. I think today there's a realization, a stark realization, that an attack is not only an inevitability, but it's just a question of time. How long and how bad will that attack be? So therefore, leaders of healthcare systems are reconsidering the prioritization of cybersecurity controls in order to protect this critical national asset.
No matter how much advice you give, the weakest link is always the human. So where does the factor of advising individuals come in?
So security education, training and awareness is probably the single biggest bang for buck for any cybersecurity professional in any profession. 97% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing attempt, right? So if we can present some level of due diligence through training in our staff, then we've, by a large shot, reduced the threat surface to the hospital, because all of our staff are working in a single unified manner to ensure patient safety.
Now, are you optimistic that the battle against cyber attacks is being won, or is there such an evolution in the nature of these cyber attacks that we will never be safe?
It's a very good question. I think that the goalposts are moving all the time, right? This is something that is not going to be easily won, a battle that's not going to be easily won. Cyber criminals are highly inventive, and they're always coming up with new attack vectors that they can infiltrate our health data and our health IT systems, for example. The big concern is that we need to mirror those changes, right, in our defense posture in order to protect hospitals, their data, their systems, and obviously patient safety from these sorts of attacks.
Such a worrying term, attack vectors. Professor Richard Steinings, thank you very much for your time. Much
Thank you.
appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Amsterdam. Trust us, there are many reasons to see Amsterdam other than the things the city is notoriously known for. A few walks into Amsterdam and you'll certainly fall in love with it. The Dutch city is unique and amazing, and there's definitely so much to do. First, you can just enjoy the weather, take in the magnificent views, and ride a bike around the city. You can easily rent one. There are so many bikes, hundreds and thousands on the streets. It's definitely a great way to see the city, enjoy the scenery, and mingle with the locals. You must also visit the Dam Square for a dose of the city's history. You can check out the Royal Palace, the Nieuwe Kerk, or New Church, and the National Monument. Aside from seeing the sights, you can also shop or try the local delicacies. One of Amsterdam's specialties are its waffles. These sweet treats are excessively popular. Their famous Stroop waffle is made from 2 thin layers of grilled waffles stuck together with syrup. You can eat it however you like, with more sweets or fruits, such as strawberries. You'll also love Amsterdam for its local beer. It's a must for those who love beer. After all, the city is considered home of Heineken International Headquarters. Not much of a beer drinker? No problem, as there are many cafes you'll surely stroll by. What's best about these cafes are their seats that face the streets, the perfect way to people watch. Aside from that, there's also the Fashion and Museum District. Notable museums are the Rich Museum, the Van Gogh Museum, and the Stedelijk. Definitely not to be missed. The city is also a place to shop high-end luxury brands. Amsterdam is also known for its great shopping malls, housed in historic buildings, such as an old post office. The buildings are of great design and are luxurious sights to see. Inside it are the top-tiered brands for both men and women, beauty finds, and more. Indeed, the city's got everything you'll need.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Rio de Janeiro. It's a chill, fuss-free Southern American city where anything and everything goes. You'll get a taste of the old and the new, fast and slow, and the luxurious and the modest. It is called Cidade Marvelosa to its local inhabitants. It is also known as a super city, with practically more than 14 million people residing in it. It is a city of history, culture, and tradition, as well as hip, flair, and style. The city is known for its picturesque views. The jaw-dropping beauty of the landscape is all thanks to the Atlantic Mountains nearby, with flourishing rainforests. These mountains actually play a big role in the city's population. It makes up most of the area in the south. Relaxed and carefree, tourists get to go on peaceful nature trips where they can make the most out of the postcard-worthy views. Meanwhile, the north area is slowly getting crowded, with sprawling suburbs rapidly taking over. And the west is quite busy too, with huge malls being built alongside highways and multi-lane roads. But the cool, carefree vibe remains thanks to the beaches nearby. And Rio's golden beaches are a marvel too. But the things to do in the city are endless, no matter the weather, because the city is teeming with infectious cheer and creativity that's definitely attractive for tourists. There's the famous Copacabana, which has everything for you. Like the locals, walk by the beachside in the early morning and sneak in some exercise, or perhaps play some football, enjoy the sunset, or dance to the samba music that's sure to be playing nearby. Then visit the Copacabana shopping district. Take a commute to the town's known historic center, to the city's stunning architecture and structures that won't fail to amaze you. The buildings are known to be influenced by a blend of historic Portuguese colonial architecture. It blends well into Rio's modern city lifestyle and the famous Brazilian atmosphere. Finally, cap off the day with an unforgettable sunset experience. In the early evening, get back near the beach to watch the sun set. Rio is truly a city that's sought after for its tropical weather and laid-back charm, which never fails to lure travelers who decide to stop by.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and